They threw her out like trash, convinced she was nothing but a gold digger, clinging to their family fortune. Richard Galloway laughed as he handed his wife the divorce papers in front of his entire wealthy family, mocking her cheap clothes and quiet demeanor. He thought he was trading up for a billionaire heiress. He thought he had won. But Richard made a fatal calculation. He didn't check who actually owned the company he was desperate to merge with. He didn't know that the woman he'd just humiliated wasn't a pauper. She was the silent titan of industry, capable of destroying his entire legacy with a single signature. And by the time he realized the truth, it was already too late. The crystal chandelier above the dining table at the Galloway estate cost more than most people earned in a decade. It cast a fractured, shimmering light over the guests, illuminating the diamond necklaces and the forced smiles of the city's elite. It was Richard Galloway's 35th birthday, and also ostensibly his 5th wedding anniversary to Isabelle. Isabelle sat at the far end of the table, her hands folded quietly in her lap. She wore a simple navy dress she had bought off the rack at a department store 3 years ago. It was clean, modest, and completely out of place amidst the sea of bespoke Italian silk and Parisian couture surrounding her. Richard Darling, Catherine Galloway. Richard's mother said, her voice carrying that sharp, aristocratic lilt that sounded like glass breaking. She swirled her vintage Pinot Noir. The merger with the Sterling Group. I hear rumors. Is it finally happening? The table went silent. The Sterling Group was the white whale of the business world, a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate that owned half the shipping routes in the Atlantic and a significant chunk of the tech sector in Silicon Valley. Nobody knew who the CEO was. The company was famous for its anonymity and its ruthlessness. Richard, a handsome man, whose vanity was beginning to erode his jawline, leaned back in his chair. He loosened his tie, a smirk playing on his lips. It's as good as done, Mother. Their board has agreed to a meeting next week. Once we secure that partnership, Galloway Industries won't just be a national player. We'll be global kings. A round of polite applause rippled through the room. Men in tuxedos nodded approvingly. To the future king of industry, shouted distinctively loud Uncle Alistair from the other end. Isabelle looked up, her eyes soft and unreadable. Congratulations, Richard. You've worked hard. Richard turned to her. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, sneering indifference. The room sensed the shift in temperature. The clinking of silverware stopped. Thank you, Isabelle, Richard said, his tone dripping with condescension. Although I suppose hard work is a concept you struggle to grasp given your leisurely lifestyle. A few guests chuckled nervously. Isabelle didn't flinch. Running this house is work, Richard. Running the house... Catherine scoffed, setting her glass down hard. Please, girl. We have maids for the cleaning, chefs for the cooking, and gardeners for the grounds. You sit in the library reading those dusty books all day. You are a passenger on this ship, Isabelle. A passenger who didn't pay for a ticket. Isabelle took a slow breath. She was used to this. For 5 years, she had played the role of the orphan, the nobody the woman Richard had rescued from a coffee shop job. She had signed a prenup that gave her nothing. She had never asked for a penny. I provide support, Isabelle said quietly. Support. Richard laughed, standing up. He reached into his inner jacket suit pocket. The room went deadly quiet. Actually, that brings me to my gift. Not for me. For you, Isabelle. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and tossed it onto the table. It slid across the polished mahogany surface, knocking over a crystal salt shaker, and came to a stop in front of Isabelle's plate. "Happy anniversary," Richard said, his voice devoid of emotion. Isabelle stared at the envelope. She didn't need to open it to know what it was. The stamp of Galloway & Sons, the family's brutal law firm, was visible in the corner. "Go on," Richard urged, gesturing with his wine glass. "Open it. I want everyone to witness my generosity." Isabelle's fingers didn't tremble. She opened the flap and pulled out the document. Petition for dissolution of marriage. "I'm divorcing you, Isabelle," Richard announced to the room, as if he were ordering a steak. "And before you start crying and begging, read the terms. I'm being incredibly generous. You get to keep your used car. You get a check for $10,000 to help you find a studio apartment somewhere, far away from here. And in exchange you leave tonight." "Tonight?" Isabelle asked, her voice steady. "Tonight," Catherine chimed in, smiling viciously. "We need the room. You see, Richard needs a partner who fits our future, a woman of status, a woman who brings something to the table besides a depressing demeanor and cheap shoes." As if on cue, the double doors of the dining room opened. Walking in was Vanessa Kensington. Tall, blonde, and dripping in emeralds, Vanessa was the daughter of a steel magnate. She walked with the confidence of someone who had never heard the word no. "Hello, everyone," Vanessa purred, walking straight to Richard. She kissed him on the cheek, leaving a smear of red lipstick, and looked down at Isabelle with pitying amusement. "Oh, is she still here? I thought the garbage collection was on Tuesdays." The room erupted in laughter. It was cruel, primal laughter. They were the pack, and Isabelle was the wounded deer. Isabelle looked at Richard. "Is this what you want, Richard, to throw away 5 years for a merger and a social climb? I'm throwing away dead weight." "Isabelle." Richard leaned over the table, whispering loud enough for everyone to hear. "Face it. You're boring. You're poor. You're nobody. Vanessa is the future. Her father knows the board at Sterling Group. With her by my side, that deal is guaranteed. With you, I'm just a man with a charity case." Isabelle stood up. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She picked up a pen from the table, a Mont Blanc fountain pen Richard prized highly, and uncapped it. "You're right, Richard," Isabelle said, her voice cutting through the laughter like a razor blade. "I don't fit in here." She signed the papers with a flourish, the ink dark and permanent. "I don't want the $10,000, she said, tossing the papers back at him. "And I don't want the car. Keep it all. You're going to need every penny you have." Richard snatched the papers, checking the signature. He grinned. "Pride to the end. Stupid girl. Get out of my house." Isabelle turned and walked toward the door. She stopped as she passed Vanessa. She leaned in close, whispering into the other woman's ear. "Check the foundations, Vanessa. Houses built on sand tend to collapse when the tide comes in." Vanessa rolled her eyes. "Security escort this woman off the premises." 2 burly guards stepped forward, grabbing Isabelle by the arms. She shook them off with a surprising amount of strength. "I can walk myself out." As the heavy oak doors slammed shut behind her, the sound of champagne corks popping and renewed laughter echoed from inside. They were celebrating her exit. Outside, the rain had started to pour. Isabelle stood on the gravel driveway, the cold water soaking her cheap dress. She reached into her purse and pulled out a phone. Not the cracked iPhone 8 Richard allowed her to have, but a sleek prototype satellite phone with no brand markings. She dialed a single number. "This is Sterling," she said. Her voice was no longer the soft, submissive voice of the housewife. It was the voice of a commander. Initiate Protocol 0. A deep voice on the other end responded instantly. Ms. Sterling, we thought you were undercover for another 6 months. The undercover assignment is terminated, Isabelle said, watching the lights of the Galloway mansion flicker in the storm. Richard Galloway just filed for divorce. He wants to merge with us. Shall we reject the proposal, ma'am? No, Isabelle said, a terrifyingly cold smile spreading across her face in the darkness. Accept the meeting. I want to handle the negotiations personally and prepare the helicopter. I'm done walking. 3 days later, the atmosphere in the Galloway corporate headquarters was electric. The acceptance email from the Sterling Group had arrived that morning. Richard was strutting through the glass-walled corridors of the 30-story building like a god walking among mortals. Get me the financials, he barked at his terrified assistant, trembling under the weight of a stack of files. And make sure the conference room is prepped. Champagne on ice. The vintage Dom Perignon, not the cheap stuff we serve the interns. In his executive office, Catherine was lounging on the leather sofa, scrolling through her iPad. I told you, Richard, it was Isabelle. She was the bad luck charm. The moment you cut that cancer out of your life, the Sterling Group said yes. It's fate. It's strategy, Mother, Richard corrected, adjusting his Italian silk tie in the mirror. Vanessa put in a good word with her father. Her father made a call and voila. We are about to become billionaires. Have you heard anything from her? Isabelle. Catherine waved a dismissive hand. Not a peep. The security guard at the gate said a black sedan picked her up down the road that night. Probably found some other poor sap to leech off of by now. Forget her. Focus on the prize. Richard nodded, spraying a cloud of expensive cologne. The meeting is set for 2:30 p.m. They said the CEO is sending a proxy first, then the principal will arrive to sign. Typical power play, Catherine mused. They want to intimidate us. Don't let them. Remember, we have the manufacturing infrastructure they need. At 1:55 p.m., the Galloway executive team assembled in the main boardroom. It was a room designed to intimidate with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Vanessa was there, seated right next to Richard, her hand possessively on his arm. My father is so proud of you, Richard, she whispered. He said if you pull this off, he'll give us the yacht for our honeymoon. When I pull this off, Richard corrected with a wink. At exactly 2:00 p.m., the double doors opened, but it wasn't a team of lawyers that walked in. It was an army. 12 men in identical charcoal grey suits entered in perfect synchronization. They didn't look like lawyers. They looked like predators. They carried black briefcases and wore earpieces. They silently lined up against the back wall, arms crossed, staring straight ahead, behind dark sunglasses. Richard swallowed hard. Gentlemen, welcome. I assume you are the advance team for the Sterling Group. One of the men, a tall figure with a scar running through his eyebrow, stepped forward. We are the security detail and legal counsel for the chairperson. Please take your seats. The chairperson requires absolute silence upon entry. Chairperson, Richard whispered to his mother. I thought it was a CEO. Titles change, Catherine hissed back. Just shut up and smile. The tension in the room was palpable. The air conditioning seemed to stop working. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably in her seat. This is a bit dramatic, isn't it? Quiet, the scarred man commanded. The sound of heels clicking on the marble floor outside the boardroom echoed. Click, click, click. It was a slow, deliberate rhythm. The doors swung open wide. A woman walked in. She was wearing a white tailored power suit that cost more than Richard's car. Her hair, previously tied back in a messy bun, was now a sleek, cascading wave of dark silk. She wore sunglasses that hid her eyes, and her lips were painted a deep blood red. She didn't walk. She glided, radiating an aura of absolute crushing power. She walked to the head of the table, Richard's seat, and stood there. The scarred man immediately pulled the chair out for her. Richard stood up, confused. "Excuse me, miss, that's my—" "Sit down," the woman said. The voice. Richard froze. His blood turned to ice in his veins. He knew that voice. But it sounded different, sharper, colder, commanded with an authority he had never heard before. Catherine dropped her pen. Vanessa's mouth fell open. The woman reached up and slowly removed her sunglasses. Piercing green eyes stared back at them. Eyes that had looked down at the floor for 5 years were now burning with a fire that threatened to consume the entire room. Isabelle. Richard breathed the name coming out as a strangled gasp. Isabelle Sterling didn't smile. She tossed a thick leather binder onto the table with a heavy thud. "Hello, Richard," she said, taking his seat at the head of the table. "I believe you wanted to merge with my company. Let's talk business." This is a joke," Catherine stammered, standing up. Her face turning a blotchy red. "What is she doing here, Richard? Get security." "She's crashed the meeting." "Ms. Galloway," the scarred man interrupted, stepping between Catherine and Isabelle. "I would advise you to sit down, unless you want to be removed from your own building by federal marshals." "My building?" Catherine shrieked. "Isabelle!" Richard said, his mind racing, trying to put the pieces together, but failing. "What is going on? Did you get a job as a secretary for the Sterling Group? Is that it? Look, I know you're angry about the divorce, but interfering with $1 billion deal is a felony. I can have you arrested." Isabelle finally smiled. It was a terrifying sight. "Secretary." She laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Richard, you really never did pay attention, did you? You never asked about my maiden name. You never asked about my parents. You just assumed I was nobody, because I didn't flash money around like a toddler with a credit card." She tapped the binder. "My name is Isabelle Sterling. My grandfather founded the Sterling Group. My father expanded it, and I own it. All of it. 100% of the voting stock." The silence that followed was heavier than the grave. "No," Vanessa whispered. "That's impossible. You wore rags. You drove a Honda." "I drove a Honda because I hate Ferrari gas mileage," Isabelle said with a shrug. "And I wore rags because I wanted to see if a man would love me for me or for the billions in my trust fund." She looked dead at Richard. "I got my answer 3 days ago, didn't I?" Richard sank into his chair, his face pale. The realization was hitting him like a freight train. The leech he had kicked out the woman he had humiliated for 5 years was the most powerful woman in the room. "But," Richard stammered, his voice trembling, "but the merger. You accepted the meeting." "I did," Isabelle said, opening the binder, "because I intend to buy Galloway Industries." Richard's eyes lit up with a flicker of hope. You do? So we can still do business." "Isabelle, honey, look, the divorce papers haven't been filed with the court yet." I'm not buying it for a merger, Richard." Isabelle cut him off. "I'm buying it for parts." She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "Galloway Industries is leveraged to the hilt. You have 3 massive loans due next month. Vanessa's father promised to bail you out if the merger happened. But the merger isn't happening, which means the banks are going to call in your loans on Monday. Isabelle leaned forward. I bought your debt this morning, Richard. Every single cent of it. I am your bank now, and I am calling in the loan. Today. You can't do that, Richard screamed. That's $300 million. We need 30 days to liquidate assets. You have until 5:00 p.m., Isabelle said, checking her diamond-encrusted watch. Or I foreclose on everything. The company, the factories. She paused, looking at Catherine. And the house, that beautiful estate where you humiliated me. It's collateral on the loan you took out in 2018. Catherine gasped, clutching her chest. My house, you wouldn't. I would, Isabelle said. And I will. Unless what? Richard begged, sweating profusely. Anything. Isabelle, please. We're family. We were never family, Isabelle corrected. But I am a businesswoman. I will offer you a buyout. One-time offer. Take it or leave it. How much? Richard asked. Isabelle held up one finger. $1. The heavy door of the conference room clicked shut, leaving a vacuum of silence that felt suffocating. The $1 offer hung in the air like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. She's bluffing, Catherine shrieked, breaking the silence. Her face was a mask of panic, the veins in her neck prominent. She has to be Isabelle, the woman who couldn't even afford a decent haircut. Owning the Sterling Group. It's a trick. It's some sort of elaborate con game. Richard was hyperventilating, loosening his tie until it hung limp around his neck. It's not a con, Mother. You saw the security. You saw the binder. She bought the debt. The bank manager called me this morning and said the note had been sold to a private equity firm. I didn't ask who. I didn't think it mattered. He slammed his fist onto the mahogany table, cracking the glass of his watch face. I divorced a billionaire and offered her $10,000. Shut up, Richard, Vanessa snapped. She was pacing the room frantically, tapping on her phone. Stop whining and think. My father will fix this. He has leverage with the banks. She put the phone to her ear. Daddy, listen, it's a disaster. There's a problem with the merger. The Sterling Group bought the debt. Yes, Isabelle, his ex-wife. No, I'm not joking. Vanessa paused, her face draining of color. She listened for 10 seconds, her eyes widening in horror. Slowly, she lowered the phone. What did he say? Richard asked, desperation clawing at his throat. Is he sending the lawyers? Is he cutting a check? Vanessa looked at Richard with a mixture of disgust and fear. He said you're radioactive. He said the Sterling Group crushed his competitor last year, just for looking at them wrong. He said if Isabelle Sterling is coming for you, he's not getting in the crossfire. He's abandoning us, Catherine gasped. But the engagement. The wedding. There is no wedding, Vanessa screamed, grabbing her Birkin bag. Do you think I'm marrying a man who is about to be homeless? My father just told me to leave the building before I get named in a lawsuit. Vanessa, wait. Richard lunged for her, grabbing her arm. You can't leave. We have a contract. We have a verbal agreement. Get off me. Vanessa shoved him back hard. Richard stumbled, hitting his hip against the table. You're a loser, Richard. You were always a loser, living off your daddy's name. Isabelle was the only thing holding you up, and you were too stupid to see it. She stormed out, her heels clicking a fast retreat. Richard slumped into the chair, putting his head in his hands. It's over. It's all over. No, Catherine grabbed his shoulders, shaking him violently. It is not over. We are Galloways. We fight. Call Arthur. Call the firm. There has to be a loophole. Community property. Yes. You were married for 5 years. If she made money during the marriage, half of it is yours. You can countersue. Richard's eyes lit up with a dim, desperate hope. You're right. California is a community property state, even if she had the money before, if she used marital funds to maintain it, or if the appreciation happened during the marriage. He grabbed his phone and dialed Arthur Pendleton, the family's ruthlessly expensive attorney. Arthur, emergency level 1. Get to the office. We're suing Isabelle. Yes, that Isabelle. I want half. I want half of the Sterling Group. Arthur's voice on the other end was hesitant. Richard, I've just received a fax. It's a cease and desist order. And, Richard, have you read your prenup recently? Of course I have. It protects my assets from her. It protects separate property, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a whisper. But there's a clause in there. Clause 14b. Neither party shall have claim to the other's pre-existing business ventures or any assets held in offshore trusts prior to the union. You insisted on that clause, Richard, to protect your trust fund. Richard froze. He remembered. He had laughed when he made Isabelle sign it, telling her he didn't want her greedy hands on his future inheritance. I can argue she signed it under duress, Richard stammered. Richard, Arthur said, I'm resigning as your counsel. The Sterling Group just sent over a file containing evidence of tax fraud in Galloway Industries. If I represent you, I'll be disbarred. Good luck. The line went dead. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. It was 4:15 p.m. They had 45 minutes before the deadline. She planned this, Richard whispered, the true horror setting in. She didn't just wake up angry. She's been planning this since the moment I handed her those papers. Maybe even before. We have to beg, Catherine said, her voice small and trembling. We have to go to her. Please, Richard. I can't lose the house. It's all I have. Richard stood up, straightening his jacket with trembling hands. We're going to her hotel. We'll apologize. We'll say it was a misunderstanding. We'll say we want her back. Isabelle didn't stay at a hotel. She was staying at the penthouse of the Four Seasons which she owned. But Richard and Catherine didn't get the chance to go there. By the time they drove back to the Galloway estate to retrieve their negotiation gifts, family heirlooms, they hoped to bribe her with, it was 5:05 p.m. The iron gates of the estate were wide open. Why are the gates open? Catherine asked, clutching the dashboard of Richard's Mercedes. Security is supposed to keep them locked. As they rounded the bend of the long driveway, the scene before them stopped their hearts. The lawn, usually manicured to perfection, was covered in trucks. Not just any trucks, moving trucks. And police cars. The red and blue lights flashed against the darkening sky, illuminating the chaos. What is this? Richard screamed, slamming on the brakes. He jumped out of the car, running toward the front steps. A team of movers was hauling out his custom leather sofa. Another team was carrying boxes of Catherine's vintage china. Stop! Put that down, Richard yelled, tackling a mover who was holding a lamp. That's mine. This is private property. Sir, step back. A police officer intervened, pulling Richard off the worker. This property has been seized. Seized by who? By the new owner, a calm voice said from the porch. Isabelle stood at the top of the stairs. She had changed out of her business suit into a stunning floor-length crimson gown. She held a glass of champagne, looking like a queen surveying a conquered kingdom. You're late, Richard, she said, taking a sip. "The deadline was 500 p.m. It's 5:10. "You can't do this," Catherine wailed, stumbling out of the car. She ran toward the house, but was blocked by 2 large security guards. "My clothes, my jewelry. My life is in there." "Actually," Isabelle said, walking slowly down the stairs, the red dress trailing behind her like blood. Everything inside the house was listed as company assets to write off taxes. "You were very creative with your accounting, Richard. Which means now that I own the company, and the debt I own the assets. The furniture, the art, the jewelry." She reached into her purse and pulled out a diamond necklace, the one Catherine had worn to the anniversary dinner. "You left this on the vanity," Isabelle said, dangling it from her finger. "It's fake, by the way. Cubic zirconia. Your husband sold the real diamonds 10 years ago to pay for his gambling debts. Did you know that Catherine—" Catherine turned to Richard, her eyes wide. "What you told me. It was insured for $500,000. I needed the cash," Richard stammered, backing away. "Mother, please focus." "And you?" Isabelle turned her gaze to Richard. "You thought you could talk your way out of it. Arthur sent me the recording of your call. You tried to sue me for money I earned while you were busy cheating on me with Vanessa." "I never cheated." Richard lied. Isabelle snapped her fingers. One of her assistants stepped forward and projected a video onto the white side of the moving truck. It was footage from a security camera. The interior of the Galloway office. 3 months ago. Richard and Vanessa were very clearly occupied on his desk. The gathered crowd movers, police officers, and a few neighbors who had stopped to watch gasped. "I own the security company that installed your cameras, Richard," Isabelle said coldly. "I've seen everything, every bribe, every affair, every time you laughed about how stupid your peasant wife was." Richard felt the ground spinning. He was naked before the world. His secrets, his finances, his lies all stripped away. "Why?" Richard whispered, tears finally streaming down his face. "If you had all this money, why did you stay? Why did you act like you were nothing?" Isabelle walked up to him close enough that he could smell her expensive perfume, a scent he realized he had never smelled on her before because she had hidden it. "Because my father told me that money masks the soul," Isabelle said softly. "He told me that if I wanted to find a true partner, I had to be nothing first. I had to see who would stand by me when the world was dark. I gave you 5 years, Richard. 5 years to show me 1 ounce of kindness, 1 ounce of respect. I waited for you to defend me when your mother mocked me. I waited for you to ask me about my dreams. But you never did." She leaned in her voice, dropping to a whisper that cut deeper than a knife. "I didn't stay because I was weak, Richard. I stayed because I was giving you a chance to be a good man. You failed." She turned around and walked back up the stairs. "Get them off my property," she ordered the police. "If they return, arrest them for trespassing." "Isabelle!" "Wait!" Catherine screamed, falling to her knees in the mud. "Where are we supposed to go? We have nothing." Isabelle stopped at the door. She didn't turn around. "I left the Honda Civic parked on the street," she called out. "And there's a check for $10,000 in the glove box. Use it wisely. It's more than you gave me." The heavy oak doors slammed shut. Richard stood in the rain, the exact spot where Isabelle had stood 3 days prior. The irony was a physical weight crushing his chest. He looked at his mother weeping in the mud and at the luxury cars being towed away. Then he saw a flash of light. Paparazzi. They were at the gates. The story had leaked. Billionaire heiress evicts cheating husband. It was going to be the headline of the decade. Richard covered his face, but it was too late. The humiliation wasn't just private anymore. It was global. The neon sign of the Starlight Motel flickered with a buzzing, dying hum. The S was burnt out, so it just read, Tarlight. Inside room 104, the smell of stale cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner was thick enough to taste. Catherine sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper. She was still wearing her designer dress from the Eviction, now stained with mud and wrinkled beyond repair. "This cannot be happening," she whispered, rocking back and forth. "I am Catherine Galloway. I chair the Arts Foundation. I don't sleep in places where people pay by the hour." Richard was pacing the small, cramped room, the carpet sticky under his dress shoes. He had spent the last 12 hours frantically making calls on his cell phone, which was rapidly running out of battery. "Damn it!" Richard yelled, throwing the phone onto the bed. "Blocked! Everyone has blocked me. The board members, the golf club, even the chaotic guys from the hedge fund. Nobody will take my call." "What about Vanessa?" Catherine asked, her eyes snapping to him with a glimmer of desperation. "She has resources. If you just explain—" "Vanessa." Richard laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. He grabbed the remote and turned on the small, boxy television bolted to the dresser. He flipped to a celebrity news channel. The banner at the bottom of the screen read, "Galloway dynasty collapses, heiress, ex-wife, takes all." On the screen, a reporter was thrusting a microphone into Vanessa Kensington's face as she exited a boutique in Milan. Vanessa, any comment on your fiancé Richard Galloway's eviction?" the reporter shouted. Vanessa stopped, lowered her designer sunglasses, and looked directly into the camera. "Fiancé, please." Vanessa scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain. "Richard was a brief lapse in judgment. I had no idea he was financially insolvent. My father and I were victims of his deception, just like everyone else. I've already annulled the engagement. I don't date homeless men." The screen cut back to the studio anchors laughing. Richard turned off the TV. The silence in the motel room was deafening. She threw you to the wolves," Catherine murmured, "after everything we did for her." "It's over, Mother," Richard said, sitting heavily in the cheap plastic chair in the corner. "We have the $10,000 cash from the Honda's glove box. That will last us maybe 2 months if we're careful. After that—" "I am not living like a peasant," Catherine shrieked, standing up. "I will not let that quiet little mouse destroy me. We have to fight back. We need to find dirt on her. Real dirt." "There is no dirt," Richard snapped. "Don't you get it? She's clean. She's Isabelle Sterling. She's untouchable." "Nobody is untouchable," Catherine hissed, her eyes narrowing. "She played a role for 5 years, Richard. That means she's a liar. And if she lied about who she was, she lied about other things. We just need to find one crack in the armor." The next few weeks were a blur of humiliation. The Honda Civic, which they had previously mocked, became their lifeline. Richard, who had never pumped his own gas, stood in the freezing wind at self-service stations, shielding his face with a hoodie to avoid being recognized. But he was recognized. At a grocery store buying instant noodles, a woman in the checkout line pointed at him. "Hey, you're that guy, the one who cheated on the billionaire." People pulled out their phones, snapping photos and laughing. Richard abandoned his cart and ran out of the store, his heart pounding in his chest. He was a pariah, the instant karma meme of the year. Back at the motel, the reality was setting in. The money was dwindling faster than expected. Motel rates, fast food, and gas ate away at their meager savings. Richard tried to apply for jobs consulting management, even basic sales, but a simple Google search of his name sent hiring managers running. He was radioactive. One Tuesday night, soaked from the rain after a failed interview at a used car dealership, Richard found Catherine sitting on the floor of the motel room, surrounded by newspaper clippings she had taped to the wall. "What is this?" Richard asked, weary. "I've been tracking her," Catherine said, her voice feverish. "Isabelle. She's hosting the Global Innovation Gala next Saturday. It's the event of the season. Every CEO, every politician, every media outlet will be there." "So," Richard grunted, taking off his wet shoes. "We're not invited." "We don't need an invite," Catherine said, pointing to a map she had drawn. "We need a moment. Look at this article from 5 years ago, before you met her. It mentions a missing gap in the sterling financial records, rumors of money laundering in the Cayman Islands. Rumors, mother, unsubstantiated." "It's enough," Catherine insisted. "If we go there, if we cause a scene in front of the world press and accuse her of fraud, the stock price will tank, the board will panic, they'll pay us to go away. It's a settlement, Richard hush money." Richard looked at the clippings. It was a desperate, insane plan. It was the kind of plan born of delusion. But as he looked around the dingy room at the water stains on the ceiling and the hopelessness in his mother's eyes, he realized he had no other choice. He was a drowning man, and this was the only piece of driftwood left. "Next Saturday," Richard said, a dark determination forming in his eyes. "We need to look the part. We'll use the last of the money to rent tuxedos and a gown. If we're going down, we're going down swinging." The Global Innovation Gala was held at the Grand Metropolitan Hall, a venue that dripped with opulence. Red carpets lined the marble stairs, flanked by velvet ropes and hundreds of flashing cameras. Inside, the air smelled of expensive perfume and fresh orchids. A string quartet played soft classical music as waiters in white gloves circulated with trays of caviar. Isabelle Sterling stood at the center of the room, looking radiant in a shimmering silver gown that hugged her figure. She was laughing with the governor, holding a glass of sparkling water. She looked free. She looked powerful. She had no idea that 2 ghosts were about to crash the party. Richard and Catherine had managed to slip in through the catering entrance. Richard had bribed a smoking waiter $50 for his access badge. They were hiding in the shadows of the grand ballroom, behind a massive floral arrangement. Richard adjusted his rented tuxedo. It was a size too small, tight across the shoulders. Catherine had spent hours doing her makeup, trying to hide the stress lines of the last month, but her eyes were manic. "Wait for the speech," Catherine whispered. "When she goes to the podium, that's when we strike. The cameras will be live." "Are you sure about the files?" Richard asked, patting his jacket pocket where he held a USB drive. The drive was empty, but nobody knew that. It was a prop, a bluff. "Just tell them you have the proof," Catherine hissed. "Fear is a powerful weapon, Richard. Use it." At 9:00 p.m. the lights dimmed. A spotlight hit the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer boomed, "please welcome the chairwoman of the Sterling Group, Ms. Isabelle Sterling." Thunderous applause filled the room. Isabelle walked up the stairs to the podium, waving gracefully. She adjusted the microphone. "Thank you." She began, her voice clear and confident. "Tonight is about the future. It's about building a world where integrity matters more than profit." "Liar!" The scream tore through the room, silencing the crowd. Richard stepped out from behind the flowers, dragging Catherine with him. He marched into the center of the spotlight, right below the stage. The security guards started to move, but Isabelle held up a hand, signaling them to wait. She looked down at Richard with an expression of mild curiosity, not fear. "Richard," she said into the microphone, her voice amplified throughout the hall. "I didn't realize you could afford a ticket." The crowd murmured. Phones went up instantly. Live streams started. "Mock me all you want, Isabelle," Richard shouted, pointing a shaking finger at her. "But the world needs to know the truth. You didn't earn this company. You stole it. You and your father laundered money through shell companies in the Caymans." He pulled out the USB drive and held it up like a grenade. "I have the proof right here. Evidence of tax evasion. Evidence of fraud. You destroyed my family to hide your crimes, but I'm here to expose you." Catherine chimed in, stepping into the light, trying to summon her old haughtiness. "She is a fraud. She played the victim, but she is a predator. She stole our home." The room was buzzing. Reporters were pushing forward, sensing a scandal. Isabelle didn't flinch. She didn't look worried. She looked bored. "That's a very dramatic speech, Richard," Isabelle said calmly. "And a very scary-looking USB drive. But I think you're forgetting something very important." "What?" Richard sneered. "That I know your secrets." "No," Isabelle said. "That I know yours." She nodded to the tech booth at the back of the room. "Screen." Behind Isabelle, a massive projection screen lowered. "You accuse me of fraud," Isabelle said, her voice turning hard. "But let's look at the audit of Galloway Industries, shall we?" The screen lit up with documents, bank transfers, emails. Here we see a transfer of $2 million from the Galloway Employee Pension Fund to a private account in Monaco, Isabelle narrated. "Dated June 14th. Who authorized that, Marcina? You mind that transfer, Richard?" Richard's face went pale. That was a loan, an administrative error. And here, Isabelle continued the slide, changing, an email chain between you and a contractor discussing using substandard materials for the new hospital wing to save costs, pocketing the difference. That's not just fraud, Richard. That's criminal negligence. The crowd gasped. The governor, who had been laughing with Isabelle earlier, looked horrified. "And finally," Isabelle said, her eyes locking onto Catherine. "For you, Catherine, the charity gala you hosted last year, the Save the Children Fund. My auditors found that 80% of the donations went to administrative fees, specifically to a catering company owned by your brother." Catherine gasped, clutching her pearls. "That's a lie, slander." "It's all on the public record now," Isabelle said. "I released the full audit to the district attorney this morning. The police aren't here for me, Richard. They're here for you." As if on cue, the side doors of the ballroom burst open. 6 uniformed officers marched in, led by a detective. Richard looked at the USB drive in his hand. It was a useless piece of plastic. He looked at Isabelle, standing above him, untouchable, righteous, and terrifying. He had walked into the lion's den armed with a toothpick, and the lion had just snapped its jaws. "Richard Galloway," the detective announced, stepping into the spotlight. "You are under arrest for embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny." "No," Richard whispered, backing away. "No. This is a mistake. She's setting me up." The officers grabbed him, cuffing his hands behind his back. Another officer moved toward Catherine. "Don't touch me," Catherine shrieked, batting at the officer's hands. "I am a Galloway. You have the right to remain silent," the officer recited, spinning her around and cuffing her. Isabelle watched from the podium as her ex-husband and ex-mother-in-law were dragged out of the gala, screaming and kicking while hundreds of cameras flashed, capturing their ultimate disgrace. When the doors finally closed, silencing their screams, Isabelle turned back to the stunned audience. She took a sip of her water, smiled, and leaned into the mic. Now, where was I? Ah, yes. Integrity. 6 months later, the gavel struck the wooden block in the Superior Court, echoing with a finality that made Richard flinch. He sat at the defendant's table, wearing an orange jumpsuit. His hair, once perfectly styled with expensive gel, was shaved close to his scalp. His face was gaunt, the stress of the last half-year carved deep into his skin. Beside him, Catherine sat in a wheelchair, looking frail and defeated, clutching a tissue. "Richard Galloway," the judge announced, peering over his spectacles, "on the counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny. This court finds you guilty. You are sentenced to 15 years in federal prison." Richard didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just stared at the table. The fight had left him months ago, somewhere between the second interrogation and the moment his public defender told him there was no way out. "And you, Catherine Galloway," the judge continued, "for your complicity in the mismanagement of charitable funds, you are sentenced to 8 years. A wail broke from Catherine's throat, a sharp, broken sound. "But I'm an old woman, I can't go to prison." "You should have thought about that before you stole from children to buy jewelry," the judge said coldly. Court adjourned. As the bailiffs moved in to cuff them, Richard looked back toward the gallery. The courtroom was packed. The media was there, hungry for the final shot of the fallen dynasty. But sitting in the back row, unnoticed by the press, was Isabelle. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't gloating. She watched with a calm, detached expression. She wore a simple beige trench coat. She stood up, meeting Richard's gaze across the room. Richard opened his mouth, perhaps to beg, perhaps to apologize, but no words came out. He realized with a crushing weight that he didn't exist to her anymore. He wasn't a husband or an enemy. He was just a bad memory she had finally processed. Isabelle turned and walked out of the courtroom before they could lead him away. Outside, the autumn air was crisp. A black limousine waited at the curb. The scarred security man held the door open. "Did it go as expected, Miss Sterling?" "It did," Isabelle said, sliding into the leather seat. "Take me to the estate." 30 minutes later, the car pulled up to the gates of the former Galloway mansion. But it looked different now. The iron gates were painted a welcoming white. The overgrown hedges had been trimmed, and there was a new sign hanging above the entrance. "The Sterling Sanctuary. A home for women in crisis." Isabelle stepped out. The driveway was bustling with activity. Contractors were fixing the roof. Gardeners were planting bright flowers. A young woman with a clipboard ran up to her. "Ms. Sterling, the renovations on the main hall are almost done. We've turned the old dining room into a community learning center." "Excellent," Isabelle said, walking through the front doors. She walked into the dining room, the very room where Richard had handed her the divorce papers on their anniversary. The heavy mahogany table was gone. The crystal chandelier that cast fractured light was gone. Instead, there were rows of desks with computers. Sunlight streamed in through the open windows. It didn't smell like old money and repression anymore. It smelled of fresh paint and hope. Isabelle walked to the spot where she used to sit, the quiet corner. She ran her hand along the back of a new ergonomic chair. "We're going to help a lot of people here," the young woman said, standing beside her. "It's a beautiful thing you're doing, turning this place around." "It's an exorcism," Isabelle replied softly. "Bricks and mortar don't make a home. Love does. And since this house never had any, I thought we should import some." Her phone buzzed. It was a text from the Sterling Group's board of directors. Stock up 12% this quarter. The acquisition of Galloway Industries' manufacturing plants has been fully integrated. Profitability is at an all-time high. Isabelle swiped the notification away. She didn't care about the stock price. She cared that she was free. She walked out to the terrace overlooking the vast gardens. The rain that had soaked her the night she was kicked out was a distant memory. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the air of a life reclaimed. She had been a ghost in this house for 5 years, shrinking herself to fit into a small, cruel man's world. But the ghost was gone. Isabelle Sterling was finally truly alive. And as for Richard, as the prison bus transported him toward his new concrete reality, he stared out the barred window at a billboard passing by on the highway. It was an advertisement for Fortune magazine. The cover featured Isabelle looking powerful and serene. The headline read, "The Quiet Billionaire, Why Kindness is the Ultimate Currency." Richard closed his eyes, leaning his head against the cold glass as the bus drove him further into the darkness he had built for himself. And that is the tragic yet satisfying end of Richard Galloway. He spent his life chasing status and money, never realizing that the most valuable thing he ever had was the woman sitting right across the dinner table. It's a brutal lesson in karma. When you marry for money, you pay for it with your soul. And when you underestimate the quiet ones, you usually end up making the loudest mistake of your life. What do you think? Did Richard and Catherine deserve 15 years in prison, or was losing their fortune enough punishment? And would you have forgiven them if you were Isabelle? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal and sweet revenge, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.